And then when she started speaking, it was like, I immediately recognized it was like the presence or essence of Christ was coming off her. I'm not really sure how else to explain it other than like, it was like the way in which she spoke to me was like, it was so loving. And I really haven't been able to like shut up about things. So there were like some ripple effects like in our community. But then of course there were people who were like immediately like projected their fear onto me, where it was like, I've known you for years, like I'm the same person, but all of a sudden it felt like there was like this cardboard cutout of me, like that went like, you know what I mean? And it's like people couldn't engage with me anymore. Kind of learning to have grace for people who aren't there yet, because I think what I haven't heard talked about a lot, like in deconstruction or recognized, is the reasons why people can't go there, and the fact that like if you were to poke and prod hard enough, that like maybe their quote sin or whatever it is like that we're labeling as, you know, some horrible worldview or whatever, is actually protecting them from something worse.
All right, hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're talking to a brand new guest. Her name is Heather Hamilton. She's written a brand new book called Returning to Eden that we're going to scratch the surface of today. And so Heather, welcome to the podcast. I've been really looking forward to talking to you.
Thanks, Glenn. I've been looking forward to talking to you too.
Thank you. So your book is amazing. I love it. And there's so much to talk about and so little time
I know.
for us to do it in. There's so many different topics that we could explore.
Yeah.
I was racking my brain about, I was like racking my brain about which ones we want to dive into today. But I thought that we could start with maybe the story of your spiritual journey, which you write about in the obviously opening of the book, because I feel like that story and so many aspects of it like set up the rest of the book. So I thought it would be a good place for us to begin. So maybe obviously start by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, the basic kind of things, and then take us a little bit into your story. You know, where were you in regards to your faith? Where are you now? And what are some steps that brought you from there to here?
Yeah. So, okay, my name is Heather Hamilton. I'm the author of this book right here.
Right there.
Right Returning to Eden, a field guide for the spiritual journey. Yeah. So my profession is a video producer. That's what I've been doing for about 15 or 20 years. And so about a little over 4 years ago, you know, I had done video production like for all sorts of clients, and but a large like part of that work was for churches and stuff. Like I grew up evangelical. My husband grew up evangelical, you know, like non-denominational Baptist, like very conventional, probably like a lot of people who are on this podcast.
Born right into it, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So like nothing really noteworthy there. But we, you know, were involved. And, you know, our whole community is sort of like influenced by like a really big mega church at the time, like 4 years ago. My husband was the music director there, and we were just really like, it was our whole life, you know, like there was relationships, work. He was on staff at the church, and, you know, our friends are like everything. I don't have to explain this, but it like this was like the ecosystem.
It was like your universe. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. It was our universe. So anyways, and you know, I know people like come into like deconstructing or asking questions like in all sorts of ways. And like for a lot of people, I feel like it's like, oh, there was like this question that led to another question that led to, and you know, and then eventually you're like that was not the case for me at all. I wasn't questioning. I wasn't looking to question. And like, you know, I think I'm a pretty intelligent person, but like that was just not something that was like on my radar.
Yeah.
So we were just like, you know, gung ho in, you know, all in, sold out in this ministry and everything. And Yeah, the faith piece like was just the lens for my whole life, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So getting married was like, you got to be a Christian, you got to be this kind of Christian, you know, like it was just the lens that
Check all the
everything was
boxes.
filtered.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I don't think I would have called it that
Sure.
at that point, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, and then about 4.5 years ago, I I won't get into it entirely specifically as to the why, but I basically overnight sort of had this divine revelation about a lot of things in my life. There was a lot of, you know, and up until that point, it was like, you know, I'm a good Christian. I'm successful in my job. It was like we followed the rules, and like this is the payoff. Like I have a life that I'm proud of. Yeah. And sort of overnight, like, and kind of literally overnight, like realized, okay, I have a lot of repressed trauma that I have not dealt with, and it kind of erupted. And once I saw it, it was just seeing it so quickly, like literally, you know, if you need glasses and you're just used to seeing the world as fuzzy, and then all of a sudden, like someone throws glasses on your face, like it was like, oh my God, like just all these,
it.
You cannot unsee it. And so there was just very suddenly like these major revelations about my life. And that essentially triggered what would conventionally be called a nervous breakdown, I think. Although at the time I was aware that it was like something kind of spiritual that was happening. Like it was intense, and my body and nervous system couldn't process it. And so that was all erupting, while at the same time, like all these puzzle pieces of my life were coming together. So it wasn't like, you know, I don't know, some random thing where someone has this happen and they're hallucinating. It wasn't like that. It was like it all made sense, but it was just complete overwhelm. Yeah. So over the course of about 4 or 5 days, like I started experiencing really intense panic attacks, where I know that a lot of people have those in their common, but it was like back to back to back. That sort of kind of threw me in this to this descent. So I kind of described the intensity of this experience in the book, and how it kind of culminated in this one night where like I'm not really sure like how else to describe it, except for like I knew that I was in this psychological experience of hell. Like I knew that that is what it was, and sort of like in that, there was like sort of this recognition of like, I can't live, like if this doesn't fix itself, or there's not some kind of solution, like this would lead to suicide very quickly, you know. And I had just had a baby, we had 3 young kids, like it wasn't like I had this past of suicidal ideation or anything like this. It was like this one experience, descent. I, you know, had a very literal interpretation of the Bible, and this experience kind of illuminated like, no, this is the belly of the whale. This is hell. This is what it is. It's not a literal place. It's this. And so, anyways, there was that experience, and, you know, I told my husband, like, you have to call 911. Like you know, I'm like, I don't know what's happening from here, but like, we're not okay. We need help. And so we did call 911, and part of the emergency response team that showed up on my front porch, immediately when she started speaking, she struck me as someone who was transgender. And, you know, we live in a pretty conservative area. It was just not what I was expecting. I still was in my sort of evangelical bubble about othering, you know what I mean? It was like
us and them. Yeah.
Yes. And even when I, you know, hear people now talk about like, you know, well, we all have the image of God, we all have to love. There's still this really maybe unconscious thing in fundamentalism, where it's like, we, you know, in the mega church, there was a ton of diversity there. You know what I mean? There was people all over the spectrum that were there. But I think that there's still this thing where it's like, we treat everyone fairly, we're tolerant, like come be a part of our family. But if you grow up fundamentalist, there's still this thing in your mind where it's like, you're not supposed to be helping me. I'm supposed to be helping you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This kind of thing. So I think that is sort of where I was. So sort of this setup on my front porch where I'm like, I'm the person in ministry. You know what I mean? Like,
I was supposed to help you.
yeah, I'm supposed to be helping you.
Right.
And then you're on my porch. And so I was like struck with this. It was fear, just like this unexpected dynamic that was happening in this really vulnerable moment in my life. And then when she started speaking, it was like I immediately recognized it was like the presence or essence of Christ was coming off her. I'm not really sure how else to explain it other than like it was like the way in which she spoke to me was like it was so loving and precise. Like I felt like she was the only person who really saw me in that moment. And that's not to say like my husband was standing right there. He just didn't understand what was happening. Sure. So it was like I felt just really distinctly seen. And it was like just this peace and presence like came over me. And so anyways, from there, you know, I was able to get like the help that I needed and like move into the healing process. But for me, it was this moment of like, I know that I was just like in hell, or this is as low as it gets kind of thing. And all of a sudden, like the most visceral experience of Christ was like right on my porch in my home. And it was this kind of recognition of like, I've been like looking for this out there, like in the church, you know, like I'm going to go find Jesus or whatever, like at this church and in this ministry and da 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 da. And instead it was like right under my nose, like at my house, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what was happening inside of me was this recognition as well of like, I have carried this divine DNA with me this whole time, like since I was a child, like before church, before hearing, like this has always been here. It's like I've been looking out for it so much that I overlooked it. Like it was so deep in me that I didn't see it. So anyways, that was kind of the BCAD, like road to Damascus moment for me.
Sure.
Where I knew that I had experienced something very viscerally real. And that continued to be like, you know, that played out. Like I had a lot of therapy and this sort of thing after that, where the pieces kept coming together and I was able to like kind of integrate and give language to this experience. But I just knew like the way that I had seen the Bible and the stories and everything before, I was like, that's not it. But at the same time, it wasn't this like purely rational, logical, like follow the rabbit trail until you unravel the whole thing.
Sure.
It was like, I didn't have this word for it now, but it really was like a mystical experience that I knew was real, you know, although it was hard to articulate to other people. So, yeah, I guess I'll pause there for now, but that was sort of like my conversion or I don't really know like what you would call
what
it.
What kind of word we're going to throw on it?
Yeah, I was like, I feel like I just converted to something, but I'm supposed to be a Christian, so I don't know.
I don't know what to throw, what label to use, but I'm something.
Yes.
Yeah, so many things in your story though, like really evoke a lot of memories in my own story, because like even just listening to you tell this story now that you do tell in the book, you know, it's like, remember when I worked for Apple? I told you I worked for Apple for 11 years, and I came to Apple right after pastoring a church because I had this
I didn't know that part.
really bad, not really great experience pastoring a church, and just it brought up a lot of things in me. And I was like, well, I'm gonna take a break from, you know, ministry for a while, and I'm gonna go work for Apple for a little bit because I had some friends who worked there, and I was like, they pay pretty good and you get good benefits, so I just need a place to go and do something other than ministry, and I'll just be there for a year or so, and then we'll go back into a church, and 11 years later, I was still there. But at Apple, I met all of these people who were just drastically different than the people that I was in my little bubble. Became friends with people who are gay, lesbian. I can remember we had a morning meeting at Apple every morning, and the managers one morning called us all together and said that this certain person was going to be out for a couple of months. When they came back, their pronouns were going to be he and him, and they were going to look a lot differently because they were having some surgery. And I remember it just like blew my mind. And I'm like, I never had any of these experiences in the church. I was always told that these people needed my help.
Right.
But yet these people became my friends, and they became helpers to me, because over 11 years, we shared a lot of experiences together, and they ministered to me in just incredible ways. And like you say in the book, like I saw Christ in them. They were Christ to me. And I just blew my mind. And you can't, once you see that, you can't unsee it. Like you can't just like, wow, that must have been that must not have been reality. It must have, have to rethink what this really means. But like, once you have that experience where you sense Christ in somebody who you were always told is different than you can't unsee that. Like it has to change everything about you. And that's what it did for me. And it seems like that's what it did for you.
Oh, well. Well, and it's interesting because I know like for people like you and I who've had this like viscerally real experience where you actually go like, this is more real than anything that I've ever experienced. You know what I mean? It was like a deeper reality that I was more present to. For me, at least, I can't speak for everyone, but it is, if I had to speculate and I have my theory, after that, I kind of felt like, I don't remember what the biblical character is who like has some kind of conversion and then like goes running naked in the streets or whatever. Everyone thinks he's crazy.
Yeah.
But who was that?
I don't remember, but I know who you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. I sort of felt like that. Like it was just like, oh my God, like I see the truth. I just have to go like tell people, I was like running around like, I don't believe in hell anymore. Like it's not real.
Everyone will understand.
Yes. But I really was like that, like a kid who like had just seen the real Santa or something like that. Like, oh my God, he's real. Like Buddy the Elf or something. It was like this, where I was just like, oh, these people just never heard. So I'll just tell them, So that was kind of like my initial thing. And like, obviously, like you can imagine like how that went. What's funny is I was surprised, like, and maybe it's just because we were at this mega church, where I was kind of thinking like, oh, everyone here thinks the same way as me. And I quickly discovered like, my husband's a musician. So it's a huge church, but it was a little smaller for us because we were like in the musician community. Like that was sort of all of our friends.
Sure.
So anyways, as I was kind of like on this little, let me just blurt out my newfound revelation rampage, in the most like innocent way. I was like, there's like a lot of people here who like don't believe in hell. And I was like, what the hell? I was like, why didn't you ever tell me about this?
Where have you been? Right.
Yes. I don't like you haven't like believed in that this whole time. Like, what are you even doing here? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Even for my husband, it's like, yeah, I mean, I think I kind of let go of that like a while ago. And I was like, what are you doing? He's like, I love playing music, like it just, his whole experience of like evangelicalism was different. And his connection point was like, music and everything. So anyways, I'm getting to a point here. What I was getting to was with me, like I had some people who were understanding and it deepened relationships and like some beautiful things have come out of it. And I really haven't been able to like shut up about things. So there were like some ripple effects like in our community. But then of course there were people who were like immediately like projected their fear onto me, where it was like, I've known you for years. Like I'm the same person, but all of a sudden it felt like there was like this cardboard cutout of me, like that went like, you know what I mean? And it's like people couldn't engage with me anymore. And it was fear. And like, so even like in the deconstruction community and people who are doing this, and it's like, we just have to advocate more or try to argue with people like into seeing our perspective on this. Mm-hmm. Like I think back to myself 5 years ago and I'm like, I don't think that would have ever worked on me because I had a deep, like bodily, cellular, visceral fear of going to hell. And so until I found myself in that place and experienced sort of like the culmination of all my fear and dealt with it, it like that's basically like what cleared the way for everything. You know what I mean? I'm like, oh, I've already been to the scariest psychological place possible and seen the transformative power of it. Yeah. But I'm like, even though I feel like that something like that might be necessary for people for like true like transformation, I wouldn't have wished it on any, like seriously, it was one of those things where it's like, you wouldn't wish this on the worst person in the world. Like I hope no one ever experiences this. Yeah. So I'm like, there is like this, a psychological barrier to like, if for some people, especially if you grow up fundamentalist, which I'm like, I'm sorry, most of us were, like if we were in evangelicals, unless you just had some really like enlightened parents or something, Yeah. I'm like, there's such a visceral fear of hell that is going to prevent you having any incentive or even being able to like really adjust your theology or worldview, Yeah. So anyways, I basically realized it's not very effective for me to just go out like blurting what I believe or don't believe or what I think is real or not real. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I think that people are going to have to see this in a way that makes more sense. Like, and so I've kind of adjusted, and this is essentially like what was the motivation for the book was like this exasperation of, is there hell or no hell? Is it this or the whatever? I was like, I've been there. You know what I mean? Like I really have experienced this. And so I've sort of adjusted from going like, there's no hell, meaning like, it's not a geographical, all that's the way that we've conceived it. That doesn't exist. But like, let me explain to you the function of what this is and how it's an actual like necessary step in the process of transformation. So like a metaphor I give in the book is, like a caterpillar. Mm-hmm. From a caterpillar's perspective, like getting swallowed by a cocoon and then having your body melted is a pretty hellish experience. You know what I mean? Yeah. Which eventually transforms the caterpillar into a butterfly. So from the butterfly's perspective, it's like, oh no, this is like the best thing that can happen for you, But from the caterpillar's perspective, it's like, watch out for the cocoon. Right. Like, don't let it swallow you, So anyways, I tried to using like biblical stories, like go beyond is this literal or is this real or not real? It's like, taking these literal stories that have like deep penetration into our psyches and really are never going to be out of them. Yeah. And like recontextualizing them as like maps for psychological transformation. Yeah. And so my hope, if I have accomplished it in the book, is to like just wipe out these, you know what I mean? It's like it's like arguing over if Santa is real or not. Yeah. Instead of understanding like the spirit that Santa carries symbolically evokes certain things in your psyche that, can be like magical is not the right word, but I'm like the love and the joy and, the spirit of Christmas or whatever, like can be like mapped to those things. Yeah. And those are very real, like experiences, Yeah. So the stories are just really like vessels and containers for, the eternal spirit of Christ to like flow through. Sure. And, in order for that to happen, there's like a psychological process that you have to go through.
Yeah.
And if you're not aware of that you're experiencing a psychological process, like if you're like the caterpillar and you're not aware that like the cocoon is a natural part of your development, then you're going to end up like me. It's just like, what is happening right now?
Right.
So anyway, so my hope was to explain these as maps, which I'm like, it doesn't diminish the impact of these experiences.
Sure.
But I think it gives you enough hope to hold on and go like, okay, I'm in the belly of the whale right now. It was funny. Once I realized this, I was like, I think this is where Jonah is. I went back and looked at the story. And for the first time, I saw like in the KJV, the King James Version, Jonah saying, out of the belly of hell, I cried. He says that. I'm like, oh my God, this is what I experienced and came to the conclusion of is now what he's saying. Like the belly is hell. It's this swallowing of your unconscious to like digest and become a new creation. But so once you recognize like, this is the place that I'm in, I'm like, okay, I don't need to be too quick to try to get out of here. Like there's a lot of stuff down here that has to be digested and, kind of transformed into a new creation, which is like what happens in the belly. And then something new is birthed out of it, That's
I mean, and
where people are born from.
Yeah, and Jonah's in the belly. And so there's an essence where he's being digested in a sense as well. Like there's certain parts of him that need to be digested before he can come back out and live anew. But I mean, everything you just shared is so good. And the book, I mean, the title, Returning to Eden, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me, just going from the title and your story, what you just shared, that we're essentially going back to the beginning in a sense, where we're rethinking what these stories perhaps could mean, because we all have these rote explanations of these stories of, well, Adam and Eve means this, and hell means this, and the second coming means this, and all these different things, and we never, unless we have this experience like you just had, like you just shared, you don't really have any need to rethink it. So you're taking us kind of back to the beginning, kind of wiping the slate clean and saying, let's look at these stories for maybe what they really are outside of this perspective that we've been handed in life. Yeah. And I love that, because that fits into the podcast, because the podcast is, what if there are ways of thinking about these things that are different than what our conditions have handed us? And one of the things that I wanted to say is that the book, and you can respond to this if you want to, but your book and in reading it really helped redeem, how do I say it? Helped redeem like Bible reading for me. And what I mean by that is that like I have this complicated relationship with the Bible, and a lot of people who listen to the podcast would concur that they have a similar experience. But like on one hand, I love it, right? Because it's fascinating, it's wonderful, it's full of so many great ideas. I think that can really expand our minds and our hearts and inspire us in a lot of ways. Like I've studied the Bible for like the majority of my life, like it's always been a part of me. But then on the other hand, I feel like it's so difficult for me to separate what I might read in the Bible today from that theology that I was given as a kid in a private Christian school, evangelical Bible college, seminary. Like that lens in my head is like so cemented in there that it's very difficult to read anything like a verse about hell or the story of Adam and Eve, like apart from these doctrines that I was given. So for me, a lot of times I find it easier to just say, I'm just going to close the Bible, put it away, and think about this stuff without having the Bible in my face. And there's nothing wrong with that, because you don't need the Bible necessarily to connect with God. But for me, like I've always loved the Bible, and so I always want to take it off the shelf and read it because I love it so much. So the point that I want to make is that your book really helped me kind of invite that regular reading of the Bible back into my life, because the way that you retell the stories, the way that you creatively look at them, really feels like it gives the reader permission to do the same, like to put that theology aside that you've been handed and say, okay, let me look at this, and maybe I'll come to a conclusion that's way outside of the box of what I've been given, and maybe that's okay. Like maybe that's the whole point of the whole thing. So your book is really like a giant permission slip. That's what I'm trying to say for the reader, I think, to really look at the Bible and look at these stories in maybe ways that are different what they were given. So.
Thank you for telling me that. It makes me so happy, because it's essentially kind of been my experience too, where I'm like, I definitely did go through a phase, not a phase. I mean, I still do it, but like where I was really, I was blogging a lot, about my theological deconstruction and like what, why this isn't right, why this isn't right, whatever. And then I kind of just got bored with it once I saw this, it was like, I, yeah, I just like what you said, I was so hoping that this could be like a book that kind of heals some of that stuff, maybe simply by like rendering it like irrelevant and boring.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where it's like all of a sudden, I'm just like, what? Like thinking through these stories in just entirely different contexts where it doesn't even seem like the same thing. It's like I'm thinking about some, the symbolism in Lord of the Rings compared to like the Smurfs or something like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, what you're describing, I also kind of had that experience, and actually leads into another like theme of the book, which is like the true self and the false self.
Yeah.
Can I speak about that?
Please. That's what actually was going to be my next thing, because I wanted to hear a little bit more about how your thoughts on the Bible have evolved into seeing that motif, I guess is the word for it, of the true self, the false self. Because I was thinking, like, when I'm reading your book, I'm like, that's not like a conclusion that most people would come to in reading these stories, but the way that you see it literally in every single story. So I'd love to hear more about that. Would be great. Yeah, please do.
So there's this professor, he's not alive anymore, but he was a professor of comparative mythology. His name's Joseph Campbell. And I stumbled across him very randomly, like randomly, like his book sort of leaped off the shelf at my local library.
Read me, right?
Yeah. No, that was it. It was like I had like a weird looking symbol on the front, and I was like, interesting. So, but he said, this isn't a direct quote, but essentially he says like the spiritual life is about discovering the face you had before you were born. And that really is like what the whole Return to Eden thing meant to me. It was like, I got to pull this all the way back, like to what was my essence in my mother's womb, like before anyone had seen me, mirrored me with anything that was accurate or inaccurate. Like there were no labels, and pulling all the way back to there where it's just pure essence. And, the experience I explained at the beginning about, the hellish experience, and realizing like, it's like I had recognized that part in me that had always been there. It almost felt like amnesia or something, like waking up to like, so I call it the true self in the book. And I realized this has been with me like the whole time, and so in the book, I kind of paint this picture about like human development and spiritual development using the metaphor of like a seed. So there's a chapter in there called The Anatomy of a Seed. And essentially what I describe is like, if you think about a seed, I actually went and found one. Like if I'm like, what does it look like? You are going to picture this. Okay. Like, and that's kind of as far as it goes, like in our brain, because this is what we can see. This is an seed to an acorn tree. But if you actually cut it open, inside is like an embryo. So for this to ever like fulfill its destiny and become an oak tree, the part that you think of in your head as the seed, this is the part that has to die. So this is actually like a really great map for us, like when I'm like, who's Glenn? What does Glenn look like? It's like immediately just the outer picture of you is going to pop into my head. That's not necessarily, and I think contained in that might be like, Glenn, who, several years ago, Glenn the Christian, Glenn the white guy, Glenn, the Apple employee or whatever, like all these labels like create what is this outer shell. Okay. So when the Bible talks about like spiritual rebirth or conversion or whatever. Or, when Jesus says to Nicodemus, you got to go be born again. He's like, what does that mean? I got to go back into my mother's belly. Like, what are you talking about? Yeah. In the really intense time when I was having, that nervous breakdown, I'm like, a spiritual breakthrough. I don't, however you want to look at it.
Yeah.
I did, I had sort of what was like, I don't know what you would call it, a vision. I feel like that's a little bit weird, but I like saw myself like in a womb, and at the time it was a really like devastating kind of thing. But sort of in it was just this feeling of like, I felt so alone, like it was just me there. And at the time it was like, I'm like yearning for love that I wasn't feeling access to. Yeah. But it's going back to the very beginning, letting all the labels and everything that your mind has kind of projected onto you as you totally fall off. Yeah. And then it's the embryo inside that you can't see, that actually takes root into the ground, establishes itself, and then out of that like can become a tree. Yeah. So I think at the end of that chapter there's actually like a passage from Paul where he's like, this is what the gospel or resurrection means. Like, we're all like seeds. We're all going to become, like, when you look at the seed, you can't imagine like what this is going to look like, and that, we're not all going to die, but we're all going to be changed. Like, this is the inevitable thing. Yeah. It's sort of just a matter of time as to when this is going to happen. Like, are you going to let this false shell be buried or go into the belly? And even Jesus is like, you're going to see the sign of Jonah. I'm going to go into the heart of the earth, and I'll pop back up as something completely new. Yeah. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? You know what I mean? And like, he's describing this psychological process. Okay. Yeah. So, like, whether you believe that that's literal or not, the part that I'm describing is essential. Okay. So like, it doesn't really matter if you believe it's literal or not, if you don't have this piece that I'm talking about, if this is not a psychological transformation. Yeah. So anyways, so Paul's like, it takes root, all these different plants will pop up, and you never guess by looking at a tree that this is what it started with. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of a motif that I carry throughout the book and use all these different stories. Jonah and the whale, the Red Sea, the virgin birth, Noah's Ark, all these things to illustrate that these stories are symbolically describing this process and illustrating how it all plays out, and how, during this process, it's about healing the mind, like in our dualistic way of looking at things and labeling things. In the garden, it's like Adam labeled all the ant, once you kind of, I got to back up for a second. Okay. So the other part that I forgot is that the embryo inside of here is what grows from the tree. Like when this fruit, Adam and Eve talks about like the fruit on the tree that she picked. The fruit grows on the tree, but in order for it to survive and like become its own tree and fulfill its destiny, it has to develop this shell and fall off the tree. So this false self is completely inevitable and necessary, like for the true self to be able to like survive the brutal elements of its environment, or for us, for life, like aside from any of like relational things that might happen to us that cause trauma, or we might be tempted to like blame, like if this wouldn't happen, then I would have been able to hang on to myself, kind of thing. And I think what I'm saying is like, there's just things in life inevitably that you need protection, and so this whole process is natural and normal and inevitable.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that if the reader can see this, it can help relax some of our compulsive need to like blame something, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You're preaching. You're preaching. Come on. Come on. It's so good.
Oh man, it's like the only thing I'm not the only thing, but like when I get passionate about something, I just keep going.
No,
I'll give
that's
yeah.
so good. I was thinking like while you're talking about the seed and like you held up the seed, or people are just listening, can't see the camera, but when you're holding up the seed, like the illustration comes through so profoundly. And what I was thinking of was we tend to, and you grew up in the church, so you've had this experience, I'm sure, but we tend to demonize the false parts of ourselves. Like we're told to identify the false self, and live from your authority in Christ kind of thing. Like that's who you really are. All these other things are fake and we have to cast them out. Like there are demons. They have to go away. We have to shame them and lock them up and all these different things and tell them to go to hell and all this different stuff. But like those parts of ourself or our false self, whatever those false selves might look like for each of us as individuals, like you said, they're necessary parts of falling off the tree.
Yes.
And when they hit the ground, perhaps they've served their purpose now, and it's time for them to break off. And I think that breaking off process is a painful process, as you described in your own story. I've had my own painful experiences of the false self kind of breaking off, but it hurts. And then everything within you wants to stay as that seed because this is what feels safe. I'm locked in my shell. Everything is good. I've got all my false selves out here. Everything is great. But it's not until that false self breaks off, which can be a painful experience, that you can really begin to grow into everything that you have been created and destined to be. I think it's just such a beautiful illustration. And like you said, going from the story of Jonah, Jesus and the crucifixion, the resurrection, like that theme is everywhere in the Bible. Like once you see
the theme.
like once you see what you just described and you start reading different stories through that lens, like, oh, how did I not see this before? Yeah, it's everywhere.
Well, and I think that I won't even label it, just the reality of it is, like I think it's tempting, number one, to go like, how did I not see this before? Or how might this have been different if someone had told me this? And I kind of started to realize like, this has actually been right here, like at my disposal the whole time. I just couldn't see it. And like even going back and reading these stories, like I'll pull out all sorts of things where I'm like, there it is. Like the example of saying like Jonah was like, I was in hell, or even in Psalm 139, I believe it is, where it's like, if I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you're there. I'm like, oh, well, it says God's in hell. And I'm like, why didn't no one tell me that? You know what I mean?
I was told hell is the place where God isn't. That's what makes it hell.
And I'm like, there it is right there. No, like if I make my bed in hell, you're there, you know? And so, so I think kind of the wisdom that you're kind of alluding to about the necessity of this shell is like, and I kind of talk about this in the Noah's Ark story where, in that, like if this represents the ark, if, Noah has the ark, he's floating on the water, and then he sends the dove out, like, is it time? Is it time to like replenish the earth, like be born anew kind of thing? And the dove's like, it's not time, I didn't bring the thing. But if Noah would have decided, all right, we're opening the doors right now, then all the water's flooding in. And so the water, like in, universal mythological stories, water represents the unconscious mind. Okay. So it's all the contents of the parts of ourselves that we've repressed that are threatening and would destroy this, are going to destroy this. But if it happens too soon, then it's catastrophe. Okay. So there's like wisdom in the timing of this, where this has to make it off the tree through the brutal elements and find like a favorable spot in the ground to which it can bury itself in order for this to germinate properly. So if this shell cracks open, before it's properly buried or ready, then all the inner contents are just going to leak out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, we don't have to get into this, but like, even when we're talking about like mental health and, people who are struggling with things, or, I like watched this video the other day of like this pastor who was also like, I went to hell, and they were playing like Rihanna's Umbrella in hell. I have to send you this video.
I gotta watch that. Please send it to me.
It's like these really specific things. Like, I saw all of this and Rihanna's Umbrella was, and I was like, that sounds pretty heavenly to me, like that's what plays on my heaven, like, dance floor,
Right. It's on the number one on the playlist.
Right. So anyways, but so the thing of when I was like listening to him describe this experience, I know what he is describing was a viscerally real experience for him.
Yeah.
It goes to show that like what he's describing is reflecting his inner contents, okay, that have been like relegated to the shadow.
Yeah.
And it's sort of our ignorance about the fact that we have a shadow, that we have these like inner quote demons that we like banish to hell. It's us that are like banishing these parts of ourselves to hell.
Yeah.
But there's another section in the book called Demons and Devils, I think is the name of the chapter. And all these are like pretty short chapters because there's just so much symbolism in each of them. I wanted the reader to be able to like read it briefly and then be able to digest it.
They can almost be read devotionally. I'll throw that out there for our listeners, because you could literally read like a chapter a day and have that be like just a reflective piece that will transform your devotional life. If you've had one of those in the past, it just it brings a different element to the table. But go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I'll throw this in as like a shameless plug. I did not plan this. I set my release date for February 22nd, which was like 222, and it was exactly 4 years ago on February 22nd that I published my first blog. So when I finished the book and we were talking about the release date, I was like, I just love this day. Like, let's pick this day. So I picked it. And then I realized, so there's 46 sections in my book, including the chapters and like the epilogue and introduction and everything. And there's like 46 days in Lent from Ash Wednesday to Easter. So I was like, read one little section a day.
There you go.
Get yourself reborn by Easter.
It's a great way to market it. Let's do it.
Yes. But so in the chapter about demons and devils, I reference again Joseph Campbell, who talks, his definition of a devil is basically like an intrinsic, like dynamic, vital part of your life that has not been permitted to give expression in this world. Okay. So I think I hesitate to use this example because I feel like it's so stereotypical, but, for someone who might, identify as homosexual or something like that, or that's like part of the expression of their life, but it's so repressed, then basically they end up projecting onto other people the part of themselves that they have repressed and they're trying to destroy. Okay. So like we can see this with like, pastors who like rail against homosexuality, whatever. And it's like just an ongoing theme. You know what I mean? And I think that there's a lot of Christians who are confused about the subject, who might say like, oh, I agree with it or don't agree with it, but they're not like railing against it all the time, like a deep hatred of that. So when I see that, I think that it's kind of a joke that we make, but like, if this is something that is like a part of you that has basically like threatened to destroy this before the time has come, then this is like, it becomes a very dangerous threat. Okay. Yeah. Which the mistake is that it's originating inside of you, but you can't see that because you projected it out. So the threat seems like it's coming from the outside, but really like what you've done, because you've labeled something a threat and then decided to like attack it, you're now creating the very thing that you're afraid of. You know what I mean? So anyways, so this is basically like reframing the concept of like demons and devils. And so instead of just saying like, they're not real. Yeah. Okay. That's not exactly it. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's a part of yourself that you have banished to hell inside of you. Yeah. That has to find a way to like have expression in your life. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't remember why exactly I like went off on that tangent, but to your point of like these parts of ourselves have to fall off. And then also like kind of learning to have grace for people who aren't there yet. Yeah. Because I think what I haven't heard talked about a lot, like in deconstruction or recognized, is the reasons why people can't go there, and the fact that like if you were to poke and prod hard enough, that like maybe their quote sin or whatever it is like that we're labeling as, you know, some horrible worldview or whatever, is actually protecting them from something worse that is in here. Yeah. That they're not ready to deal with, you know? Yeah. So there's like this balance of going like, you know, I don't agree with how you view things. I think it's harmful. All those things are valid. And also understanding like human psychology and human development, and the fact that like if there's a part of a person that is still stuck with their 5-year-old traumatized self or whatever, yeah, that is absolutely terrifying for them to face, by continuing to like beat them down about something. Yep. Do you know where I'm going with this?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And so yeah, I'm hoping that like we can start to shift from a us versus them kind of paradigm into like a real understanding of like human development, even for like the people that we think are like the nastiest or most backward. Like there is a reason for that that's not necessarily like in their control or in their awareness. And like it's not until this feels safe enough that these other things can start to be explored. So I feel like really hopeful that we can start going there, but also like I do have times of just like kind of watching it and knowing like, oh man, you know, like the more that you like rail against this guy, the harder he's going to like cling to this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of maybe call it like spiritual bypassing when it comes to human development, where we just spiritualize the issue. And we say it's just cast the demon out and it'll go away. I mean, growing up, I grew up in, like I said, evangelicalism, and I went to when I went to seminary, we it was a very charismatic kind of environment, and we did a lot of power encounter, like, you know, casting out demons and doing all this kind of stuff. And one of the things I've always struggled with my whole life, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, is I always had this deep sense of like, I don't know if we call it insecurity or like a low self-esteem. Like I'm very introverted, and I just don't, I struggle sometimes to like put myself out there. And this was always a thing in school where it would always come up that's a demon. There's a demon that is telling you that you're no good, you know, that you're stupid and you're dumb, and that voice is demonic. We have to get it to go away. And so I went through so many literal like exorcisms where we would people would gather around, they anoint you with oil, they do all the praying. Usually it's pretty low key, like nobody really yelling and screaming. A couple of times like it got loud, different things happening. And for the longest time I just assumed that was the issue. It has to be some kind of spiritual thing, right? And I was talking to my friend Alexander Shaya, who's a very mystical type thinker, and he said to me, you know, what if that's not a demon? What if that's your inner child? What if that is a younger version of yourself?
Your Christ child.
Yep, your Christ child. What if that's a younger version of yourself who is parroting back to you different things that he's heard throughout the course of his life, and he's put in a situation that reminds him of when he heard that when he was little? And that just blew my mind. And so he said, I want you to do something. I want you to try for like 6 months of not trying to make that voice be quiet, but try to befriend that voice
Mm-hmm.
and see what you can learn from it. And that changed everything for me, because I realized that I don't have to cast that voice away from the table. I can
Mm-hmm.
invite it to the table. I don't have to give it the seat at the head of the table to control my life, but I can listen to it, what it has to offer me, but then speak truth back to that
Mm-hmm.
voice. And that all of that just ties right into everything that you were just sharing, because like I said, we tend to spiritually bypass those different things in our life, and we try to cast them away. In reality, they're part of us, and that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think a lot of people that are coming out of evangelicalism are doing that work.
Yep.
And it's interesting, like, I won't get too deep into this, but like just at each different stage of human development. I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Wilber. He developed this. Yes. Okay. Yep. So to keep it real simple, essentially what he did is he went and studied like hundreds of different developmental models, like across cultures, across demographics. You know, he's taking like cultural ones, or people who, you know, are developing that through the lens of like feminism or, you know, whatever. He took them all and basically like found a pattern in all of them, which to keep it very simple is more complicated than this, but essentially we all go through an egocentric phase where, well, egocentric, ethnocentric, global centric, and then integral. Okay. So ego is basically, it's this, you know, like I love me, I love what I'm about kind of thing. Ethnocentric, it's like I love me and I love my people, you know. So that's a lot of what we experience like in our respective tribes. And what everybody goes through this. Like there's no kid that pops out enlightened who just like you know, who's not, you know what I mean? Like you have to start out as a seed before you become a tree.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
And then we moved to like global centric, where I think a lot of like post evangelicals are, where it's this like, oh, everybody has their own subjective experience. Everyone has their own worldview, you know, and I was trying to do the right thing over here, and I wasn't realizing like what this environment felt like for someone else. You know, essentially like your you start to see your narcissism, okay? Where it's like not even, you know, between my husband and I, where like when I describe my experience of a church, and we're in the same environments, he literally just it did not penetrate him the same way, okay? He's just naturally has way more boundaries like on his self, where I'm more like an octopus and I'm kind of like picking up everyone's energy in the room, you know, all this kind of thing, which there's like gifts and challenges to each part. So in each of these different stages of development, there's like light and shadow things, okay? Like even within fundamentalism, or when you're in the ethnocentric tribal stage, there are things from that are valuable. I'll give you an example. So my husband, he just got done doing 4 months of chemotherapy. He had lymphoma. He had to go through this. And it's like, you know, I've been writing about my experiences with evangelicalism, you know, critical, and, you know, all these ideas that don't really like mesh with it or whatever, where I felt pretty alienated from that community. When this happened, like all the evangelicals showed up like with food, you know what I mean? And it was sort of this humbling thing for me. I was like, damn it. You know what I mean? Like, thank you. Like, I felt so loved and cared for, you know what I mean? And it was just like, okay, you know, like I can look at that and go like, you know, when shit hits the fan and the old Baptist ladies are like, let me cook you up all this food and bring it to you. I'm just like, that is wonderful. You know what I mean? And I really appreciate like that those kind of values where it's like traditional, we take care of our own kind of things, you get those from that like ethnocentric phase of your life. Okay. Yeah. So, but when you move to the global centric thing and you start to realize like, you're putting yourself in other people's shoes, we all have all these different perspectives. All the different perspectives need to come to the table kind of thing. The kind of the shadow side of that is like you can only have that perspective once you've transcended a lower perspective. Okay. Yeah. And when you're in the lower perspective, the higher perspectives feel very threatening. Again, going back to like, we're not ready to see this yet, Yeah. And so when we try to like force our perspective, a lot of times it makes this shell more concrete.
That's right.
As opposed to like, and if we really do feel like, oh, this is a more enlightened way of thinking, then the responsibility is kind of on us to like move evolution forward, like to move human consciousness forward, which means we have to understand the psychology of where people are. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the shadow side of like the global perspective. And then to use Ken Wilber's term, like the integral is basically being able to see all of this. Okay. And going like, if someone is in an egocentric stage, and well, I won't throw out that name because I don't want to like alienate people, but if there's an adult who is extremely egocentric and like it's compulsive, right? Okay. In like developmentally, that person might still emotionally be a 5-year-old. And I'm not saying it as like a dig. It's like that is as far as he was permitted to like develop so far, and then his body just got bigger kind of thing. So we can't expect, or we can't like rail on 5-year-olds for not having the awareness of a 30-year-old.
Right.
So anyways, I totally understand like the arguments about like taking responsibility and blah, 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 blah.
Sure.
But like, I think if anyone's honest about like the whole spectrum of like human psychology and growth, which we have to be at this point, because we have such big problems.
Yeah.
It's not like that we don't try to contain or set boundaries or whatever on people who are like wreaking havoc in their egocentricity. But like we can't expect that like by shaming and attacking that's gonna like get us to where we need to go.
Yeah.
So anyways, I'm hoping that like for people who have progressed, through their own like struggle, through their own like working out of their own salvation to like, work it out with fear and trembling. Like this is like scary, terrifying stuff. And when we're like really honest about that, there's like some compassion to be had for people who haven't done that yet. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So anyways, I'm hoping like we can start kind of turning the gem as like figure out how do we be a more helping, inviting hand, because I do think like inside this, it is the true self, it is the potential, like in my book, there's a quote by this old Catholic mystic named Carol Houselander, and she says, Christ in the tomb is still Christ. Okay. So it's like, even if a soul seems to be dead, you still have to have reverence for the divine DNA and the potential for that to resurrect in somebody. Yeah. And so I think that how I try to look at people is, even if they're like seem emotionally disfigured or psychologically whatever, it's like I can still speak to that part of them, like the Christ within, and hope. And I think that part, there's something that does, when you mirror it properly, it recognizes itself, it sees itself. So there might be a lot of shell. It's not necessarily going to come like bursting awake at that moment. But I feel like that's the perspective that we have to have if we're going to like move forward as a species.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. Well, Heather, this has been a lot of fun, but we are just about out of time. And but thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Thank you for your book. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm excited for the book to get out there.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Glenn.
Yeah, absolutely. And real quick, where can people go to connect with you and your work online? Any kind of websites, social media that you want to direct us to? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So the book Returning to Eden comes out on February 2nd, 2023. You can visit my website. It's just returningtoeden.com. On Instagram, Heather Hamilton 1, and on Facebook, Heather Hamilton author.
Awesome. Well, I'll put the links. Yeah, I'll put the links in the show notes, and I will do this again because I think we have more things to talk about.
Yeah,
I already have a whole bunch of questions that I want to ask you, but we just don't have time.
Yeah, 2.0. I would love it.
Thank you.